listeners. For today's episode, we're discussing 3 stories by the Argentinian author Jorge Luis Borges. The first, The Library of Babel, is where this podcast actually got part of its inspiration and namesake. The second, Tlon, Uqbar, Orbis Tertius, is a mysterious story about the conjunction of an encyclopedia and a mirror. And the third story, Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, is pretty much about what the title implies, i.e. Pierre Menard wrote Don Quixote. And so did Cervantes, but Pierre Menard's version is better. You might be wondering, what the hell am I talking about? And I think it might be good just to dive in to this episode or to read some of them before you listen. Borges is somebody who has a very special place in my heart. He seems to write in such a way that you read one of his stories, it's maybe 5 or 6 pages, and it's sort of like, like a bomb goes off in your brain. I end up thinking about his stories for much longer than it takes me to read them. There's such a compression of meaning, of ideas, of sort of theoretical extensions in a way that's surprising and addicting and just really stimulating. And John and I go a bit long on these 3 stories. You'll notice this episode's a bit closer to 2 hours, but it's some really great stuff. So I urge you to check out these stories on your own, or either before or after this podcast, and diving in. The less you know ahead of time, the better, I think. As always, give us a follow on Infinite Library Pod on Twitter, the X, everything website, whatever it's called, or shoot us an email at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Intuitively knows what an illustration would be, even though they've never seen one in their entire lives.
Yeah, that's one of the problems with that story is there's like multiple complications when you try to think about it. Like it's a very it has a lot of like contradictions within itself. That particular
the bit where they're like he theorized that the book was written in a Finnish variant of Portuguese. And it's like, well, how would he know what any of those were? What language are they speaking right now?
Well, actually, that kind of fits with us, John. Like the idea that we weren't in the library and now we're trapped in it. Like there's a nice parallel there, honestly. But
we're the last 2.
Yeah.
when you die, I'll shove you off the ledge and you'll
just dissipate.
The open air will be will be your grave.
Yeah, my sky burial within a library. Yeah. So
I just want to say this because I don't know if we'll get to in the episode or not, but I like on my second read through, I realized when he says there's the 2 closets, one for sleeping, one for your biological necessities. The first time I was like, oh, that's a bathroom. And then I thought about it some more. It's like, oh, that must also be where they eat.
Yeah. and they play those dice games where they make up their own books. And those are considered like highly immoral and bad. Yeah. So.
Because there's no food or water.
Yeah. It's like, you're given this magnificent idea, and then Borges almost is just like, I guess I have to flesh this out. like the idea of
just enough.
Yeah, just enough. Right. I think my favorite line though is the idea that the light in each hexagon is insufficient and unceasing. Yeah.
I noticed that on this on that read through too. I was like, oh, that's such a perfect description.
Yeah, it's perfect, and also yeah, sure. What's keeping the light on in the library? It's it doesn't matter. It matters is that the light is not enough to read.
You can't quite get comfortable. Yeah. And then it's the ceiling is only slightly higher than the height of a librarian. So you're also just kind of not totally comfortable the whole time. You have to sleep upright in a closet.
Yeah, and then you wake up and then you just pull a book off the shelf and it just says gobbledygook for pages and pages.
MCVD, MCVD, MCVD.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Another day in paradise.
Yeah. Oh, man. Welcome, dear listeners. Another episode of the Infinite Library. I'm your host, Ben.
And I am your host, John.
And today we're going to learn about where the Infinite Library originally started. And that is in the works of one Jorge Luis Borges. And we're gathered today to talk about three stories out of his really huge and sort of impossibly wonderful catalog. We're talking about three of them collected in either labyrinths or ficciones, depending on who you ask. We're talking about my personal favorite, the Library of Babel, but also the big one, Tlon, Uqbar, Orbis Tertius, I believe. I'm probably mispronouncing it. And
Tertius.
Then Tertius, Orbis Tertius, yeah. And then the last one is sort of an afterthought, but also quite a good one, is Pierre Menard, author of Quixote.
Borges is kind of one of those figures that, in retrospect, kind of surprising we have not really talked about him much on the show, because I feel like we definitely talked about him in kind of our brainstorming session for the show when we were kind of originally sitting down and planning this project out last fall. And I think that the title of the show was really kind of a wink to, if not Borges, a literal Borges story, then very much to kind of the Borgesian aesthetic
of a giant, huge, unending library. And as we'll get to in the story of Library of Babel, a lot of inside the library is nonsense.
Well, kind of as a way of starting and maybe kind of talking a little bit about Borges as a figure before we dig into one of the stories. Ben, I think this is probably as close as we're going to officially get to a 1-year anniversary for the show.
True. Yeah.
And I think actually, again, kind of apropos, we're doing Borges right now because one of the things in our first episode ever on The Name of the Rose is very much another work that is paying homage to Borges. The antagonist of that story is actually a thinly veiled, at least reference to Borges's name. Jorge of Burgos.
the blind librarian. Yeah.
The blind librarian who hates laughter. Yeah, Ben, I know you kind of did a little bit of kind of background research on Borges as a guy. So do you want to tell us if Eco's read on him in that book was a fair shot, or was he being a little mean, as Italians are wont to be?
Well, I mean, as far as we can tell, Borges didn't hate laughter as well as being like devoutly religious. But I think the idea of the blind librarian, or as a librarian who is in charge of all of these books, but is somehow sort of ironically denied access to them, is something that you kind of see everywhere. And so it's useful to talk about Borges just because a lot of his life has a lot of sort of fascinating ironies, but also that's kind of where it comes from. So Borges is an Argentinian. He was born in 1899 to intellectual middle-class parents. And crucially, he's descended from military and political figures that were prominent in struggles for Argentinian national independence. And Borges is he's a bookworm, he's kind of like us. And in a great sort of story I found called An Autobiographical Sketch, he talks about how he says, as most of my people had been soldiers, even my father's brother had been a naval officer, and I knew I would never be. I felt ashamed quite early to be a bookish kind of person and not a man of action. And then sort of in that sort of area, he also describes how wonderful his father's library is. And he says in a very Borgesian way, if I were asked to name the chief event in my life, I should say my father's library. In fact, sometimes I think I never strayed outside that library. which is a great sort of like the primal scene for Borges is his father's library. Now, how did he sort of get this reputation as the blind librarian? Well, so Borges had a number of odd jobs along with sort of writing his own work. He was known as a poet. Then there was sort of a shift in his writing, and there was more of a focus on shorter stuff, short stories, stories that blended weird fact and fiction, as well as parables and other sort of like small essays. Now, so one of the things that happened on the long road to him becoming because at one point he became, and this is the important part, the director of the Argentinian National Library, which happened in 1955. And when he received this award, he was more or less completely blind. So he is in charge of all of the books in the Argentinian library, and he couldn't read them. And as he says in my poem where he writes about this, I speak of God's splendid irony in granting me at one time 800,000 books and darkness. and at one point before he sort of had that role, he was given a job at a library, and it was a minor role. He was a very minor position, he says, as a first assistant in the Miguel Cane branch of the municipal library. And he was basically told not to work so much because there was a catalog of books, and he sort of checked in 100 books, and all of his coworkers said, listen, if you keep doing this, you're going to get us out of a job, and we don't like to work. So they told Borges, stop working so much. So he would do his job for an hour, and then he would write and read for something like 4 to 5 hours. And that was his initial job, and that's when he kind of got the time to produce a lot of his like most important work. Now, John, does that sound like an ideal job to you?
Lord, I see what you have done for others, and I pray that you do the same for me.
1 hour of work for 4 to 5 hours of literary pursuits.
Something I just kind of to append on what you said thus far, Ben, something else I find interesting with Borges is that he was a professor of literature, but specifically of English literature.
Yes, yeah.
Which I do think kind of is a reason that his work is so well received in kind of the, I guess you would say, like kind of global north, the Anglosphere, for lack of a better term. His work, I don't know if I feel like I've heard before that at least some of his work he wrote in English rather than writing in Spanish and then having translated.
He also worked with a translator who got 50% of the proceeds as well, which is kind of unheard of if you ask me. And I didn't even know about that until we were sort of researching this episode, that he had like a guy that he worked with even like really closely. And he also is the guy who didn't do a lot of the translations that you can get more easily today. That was a different person. But anyway, yeah.
But there's definitely kind of an element to his work that I find interesting where he's obviously very, very influential on Latin American fiction to this day. One of our guys, Bolaño, was a big Borges fan. And, he's, I think, can probably be credited as one of the kind of forefathers of what would go on to become magical realism. But there's also a very kind of, I'd say like Anglo sensibility to his work where despite kind of the fanciful elements, there is kind of this element of like logical grounding that I think is very kind of within kind of the analytic, more Anglo tradition of literature. He subverts it constantly by using that same logic to unmoor his ideas and his concepts and his stories to kind of make the logical process actually kind of its own scary or like surreal thing. But I do feel like there is an element there that feels very familiar and maybe kind of a little more out of step with what one might expect from an Argentine author, at least in my understanding.
Bolaño also says that I believe he would like nothing more than to live under a table and read only Borges. Is what the quote that he usually says. And also, John, as you said, like a lot of the sort of controlling logic of Borges is constantly undermining itself, or to use one of his favorite images, becomes a labyrinth. We are led down a path of logical reasoning where we are quickly lost in a sort of profusion of
meaning, of fact or fiction, of nonsense, of a real story that is both unreal and also real, and sort of like the idea of sort of slowly losing your way amongst something that seems familiar is what I would say distinctly Borgesian.
Well, and one more thing before we get into the stories proper, I think it's really interesting that Borges, was a scholar, very much a scholar of kind of mystic traditions as well.
Yes, yeah.
He studied like Persian Sufi poetry and kind of Chinese mystical literature, in addition to obviously like what was coming out of the Catholic tradition that he was kind of surrounded by growing up in Argentina. And there's definitely kind of a Zen koan element to his work where you're presented with something that is kind of contradictory on its face, and you kind of try to reason it out. And in doing so, you only find, like you said, Ben, kind of more and more questions arising that, in some ways like illuminate certain things, but in other ways like make other things even less certain than they were before. And I think that Borges is interesting because, to my knowledge, he was not personally like a religious person. He clearly understands the mystical like temperament very well and the mystical kind of mode of writing, but there's no kind of obvious answer at the bottom of things.
Yeah.
In a way that obviously most mystical writers do believe that there is. So we can kind of get more into the specifics as we talk about some of the stories we want to talk about.
Also, crucially, John, these are huge questions, and Borges really never wrote a novel, which is also fascinating. He's able to kind of deal with this stuff in, 5 pages, maybe 6, a little bit more. There's a lot of compression there that is really quite wonderful, I would say.
No, it's really amazing. I know I keep saying we're going to get to the stories, and we will, I promise. But we were saying before we started recording, it's really amazing. I feel like we could easily do a whole episode on just one of these stories.
Yeah.
Even like the shortest one of the bunch, and we could easily fill 90 minutes of airtime just talking about it. And it is really astounding, the level of not detail, but just kind of profundity, I guess, for lack of a better term, that he is able to, just weigh his sentences with. And it's really something special. If you have not had the pleasure, definitely recommend giving a couple of these short stories a read. They don't take long to get through, and they will give you a lot of hours of contemplation.
Yeah, you can just read one and then think about it for a week if you feel the need. So I guess without further ado, I think John, let's start in the namesake story, the Library of Babel. And then we can move on from that. I feel like Library of Babel is the one I want to start with. So what is the Library of Babel? Well, Borges essentially presents us with the story of a librarian who is stuck in a unending library, and the library, as we are told, is the universe.
So, Ben, if you're open to it, I think that we'd be well served for these short stories with kind of reading the opening paragraph to each one.
Oh, yes, yeah.
As we start, just kind of to ground us. I think it helps kind of elucidate what we're talking about. B, I think it will show our wonderful listeners, what Borges can do in one paragraph that some less writers can't do in whole books. So the opening paragraph to the Library of Babel. The universe, which others call the library, is composed of an indefinite and perhaps infinite number of hexagonal galleries, with vast air shafts between, surrounded by very low railings. From any of the hexagons, one can see, interminably, the upper and lower floors. The distribution of the galleries is invariable. 20 shelves, 5 long shelves per side, cover all the sides except 2. Their height, which is the distance from floor to ceiling, scarcely exceeds that of a normal bookcase. One of the free sides leads to a narrow hallway, which opens onto another gallery, identical to the first and to all the rest. To the left and right of the hallway, there are 2 very small closets. In the first, One may sleep standing up, and the other satisfy one's fecal needs. Also, through here passes a spiral stairway, which sinks abysmally and soars upwards to a remote distance. In the hallway, is a mirror which faithfully duplicates all appearances. Men usually infer from this mirror that the library is not infinite. If it really were, why this illusory duplication? I prefer to dream that its polished surfaces represent and promise the infinite. Light is provided by some spherical fruit which bear the name of lamps. There are two, transversely placed on each hexagon. The light they emit is insufficient, incessant.
Yeah, that last bit, insufficient and incessant, is perfect because one, yeah, it's like we don't really care about what's producing the light in this infinite library universe. The real fact is that it's not enough. You can't see what you're reading, even if that's the only thing you're supposed to be doing. So
the library is we go. The narrator goes on to explain to us. Each one of those hexagonal galleries is filled with what else but books. Each of those books is exactly 410 pages and filled with seemingly infinite variations of, basically writing.
It's like the 20, it's the 23 letters of the alphabet plus like I think a space, a comma, and a period, something like that.
Yes, the three punctuation marks, and as one can probably assume, the vast majority of these books are completely meaningless. I was going to say illegible, but that's not actually the problem. There's no content to be gleaned from them.
Yeah, we were told that one of them is the repetition of MCD over and over again, except on the last page where suddenly it says, "Oh, time thy pyramids." It suddenly just emerges from the randomness like a diamond or something of pure meaning.
Well, and that is kind of what the library is in a microcosm. It's kind of endless periods of meaningless noise, but every so often you will stumble on something that seems to at least have the appearance of some kind of meaning.
Yeah, and so as a result of this, we are given sort of like a history of like various figures and sects that are within this library. There is sort of the idea that at first everyone is really excited because that means that there's great true meaning contained somewhere in the library, but that excitement is quickly dashed upon the realization that you're not going to find it. It's inaccessible amongst all of the thousands and thousands of books of pure nonsense.
Yes, and it's one of those things where no one really knows what they're looking for, and there's kind of, you could easily flip through a book and maybe there is truth somewhere on one page, but it's surrounded by nonsense, and so you're not going to find it. There's kind of the intimation that there is this very strange society within the library.
Yeah.
There are evidently other human beings. The narrator of our story is kind of an aged librarian who has spent many years wandering through these galleries, seeking some kind of sense of meaning in here, and kind of not having found it. He's kind of reflecting on the history and society of the library as well as he can understand it. It's not clear who he's writing to exactly or what he's even writing on.
Right.
Which is kind of one of those fascinating little lacunae in the logic of the story that are both like tantalizing, but also feel like even thinking about them feels kind of ridiculous because that's clearly not where Borges is. His focus is.
Yeah, especially too, like, it's more about like, what would you do, John? Would you like start burning books to sort of determine where the real ones are? Would you pick one book and go, this thing is important to me, as many people do in real life? Would you read widely and attempt to assemble some sort of schematic? Or, John, would you have a belief in the sacred crimson hexagon where the good books are kept?
I'm gonna say the latter. I'm gonna say that I'm looking for the manga section.
Well, and that's what's so fascinating about this metaphor, because like it so easily applies to the way people look for meaning in a random world. And he sort of lays out all of these archetypes. Like, you could, like, for instance, some people believe that there's a guy who's read the catalog, and that guy has read the one true book and thus knows everything and is considered a kind of god. Or there is, people that are just making up their own books using dice games, and those people are considered to be like, weird outcasts and like exiles for doing such practices. And even the narrator of this story goes, why am I even writing this? It exists undone in a million ways somewhere in this, combination of the library. And like all the narrator can do is say, well, at least the number isn't infinite. It's finite. It's just so big that it might as well be infinite. And that's like the only thing that he can rest on, given that every other sort of practical search for meaning in the ones I've described leads, is insoluble. There's nothing to stand on. And I find that sort of metaphor deliciously fascinating, because like, yeah, it's like I go to a bookstore, I'm looking for the good books. I want the Crimson Hexagon. I want the ones that are illustrated. I want the magic books. And do I find them? No. But do I find something that I think is going to have some meaning for me in sort of like this cursory, illusory way? Yeah, I do. I'm like, sure, I want this translation of Borges that I haven't read, or something like, and so like it's sort of this thing that like opens up fascinatingly to me as like a metaphor for trying to find meaning in sort of a world that doesn't make any sense, as well as like buying books.
Well, yeah, I agree with you, Ben. I think that maybe in this story, or maybe Tlon, I think we see this the most clearly, kind of Borges as social critic.
Yeah.
I think that when I think about like when these stories were written, it was like either in the middle, like, or not in the middle, but towards the end of, or like immediately after World War II.
Yeah.
Tlon definitely deals with this like a little bit more directly, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But kind of this idea of living in like a world without easy meaning. And I think that what is strange with the library is kind of to go back to our little reference to Name of the Rose earlier, like this feels like a very monastic setting in a way. Like I don't know about you, but when I try to picture the librarians, I picture them like in monk robes. It's this very like Spartan and aesthetic existence. They don't really seem to have any kind of bodily pleasures. There's no reference to like what they eat or how the library is peopled. They don't specifically say that there are no women, but we also don't get any confirmation that anyone ever has sex in this world. But I think about kind of Borges as someone who is kind of living through the collapse of meaning, kind of existential meaning in the Western world, kind of this idea that all these grand narratives have failed, this kind of enlightenment or religious idea that like we can make either the world is legible to us if we look at it the right way, or we can make the world legible if we measure everything like as according to our perfect human reason. Within Borges, like that is not the case. The world, even if we can kind of try to mathematically map out whether or not it's finite or infinite, like we can never see all of it, A, and B, the end of this story is he realizes that like maybe the library actually is infinite, because maybe there is a finite number of books, but you go far enough into the library and they just repeat again.
Yeah.
And so there's kind of this like day of Brahma cycle where even within kind of the great cycle of the library, that's just one like spoke in the wheel of samsara that just kind of goes even beyond that. And so any attempt to kind of understand the world through these, almost spiritual yeah, seekings for meaning is still kind of doomed just by how inconceivably vast the universe is.
And I also like too that to me also applies to somebody who's read a lot. Because like the idea is if you've read a lot, you know that there are different narratives. Like, you know, people tell different stories. So like, do you just pick one, or do you sort of realize that, as you said, like this sort of like there's an unending search? And I think I see that perspective in Borges a lot in terms of being like the librarian, or like the librarian, because as he says in the beginning of one edition that these were published in, he goes, "The composition of vast books is a laborious and impoverishing extravagance. To go on for 500 pages developing an idea whose perfect oral exposition is possible in a few minutes. A better course of procedure is to pretend that these books already exist, and then to offer a resume, a commentary." And I think, as you were saying, John, this sort of unending wheel, it's like if you sort of know that there's all of these meanings that exist and they're equally valid, what do? And I think a librarian sort of tries to kind of like deal with them in miniature and sort of in smaller versions and sort of wade through them, as opposed to kind of like picking one and saying that's the one. And I think that's closer to that sort of like wheel of samsara thing you're pointing out, where it's like, yeah, it's like I got to keep reading more about stuff in different ways to know, even though it can't stop. And I think there's an interesting comparison between this and there's a scene in The Man Without Qualities where this soldier goes to the library and goes, "Look, I'm just looking for some good ideas. Do you know where the good ideas are?" And the librarian just starts explaining to him all the different ways you could answer this question. And the soldier experiences sort of like a sense of vertigo and is like, "You're telling me that there's no list of good ideas?" And the librarian's like, "What do you mean?" And sort of like the soldier has this sort of like loss of self that happens when encountered with something like the way this librarian in this story sort of like deals with everyday existence. It's like, what do you do? How do you decide?
Yeah, I mean, even in kind of microcosm, I think that is kind of what we mean when we talk about what the infinite library is. You know, I don't know when you had this kind of realization, but I remember a while back, you know, I'll say, you know, 6-7 years, something like that. You know, I kind of realized like, oh, there's never going to come a point where I feel like I've read enough, that like I have like this grounding in literature that I'm going to feel okay, like, yeah, just saying like I have like a solid foundation in this. I'm always going to feel like I have some kind of deficiency because there's just so much more written in the world than there is time, especially, you know, once I realized that I have an interest in kind of international literature, and I wasn't just interested in things written in English. And it's like, you add even one other like language worth of books onto your list of interests, and it's all of a sudden you have twice as many books as you did before, and you already had a seemingly insurmountable like pile of books. And that's almost just if you're trying to stick to like canonical or like important books. That's without even getting into like stuff you might want to just read for fun or on a lark. And, you know, at some point you just kind of have to make peace with the fact that you know, the work is never done.
Yeah.
But you have to like find meaning in that. I guess. I guess that's what we're trying to do.
There's also a great little Borgesian commentary on finding meaning and stuff, and you can see him sort of being that ironical self of his. He goes, "My Kafkian story, The Library of Babel, was meant as a nightmare version or magnification of that municipal library, the one that he worked at, and certain details in the text have no particular meaning. The numbers of books and shelves that I recorded in the story were literally what I had at my elbow. Clever critics have worried over these ciphers and generously endowed them with mystic significance." And that's Borges being a little bit of an ass, because he's like, you know, and people are reading too much into it. But sort of that's like the point of the story, and that's like, as you were saying, John, like you kind of have to read meaning into stuff and decide what doesn't have meaning. And sometimes it's better to get kind of lost in the sauce, so to speak, so that you can actually experience new stuff as opposed to sticking to your lane. And I think, like, again, like, I think this story has such a potent metaphor for, like, reading and meaning that makes particular sense after the collapse of certain, like, meta-narratives. But also, I would argue, I think it just sort of happens as being in a library. Like, if you spend a lot of time in a library, you just realize how much there's there that you're never going to get to, and you're going to have to like figure out how you're going to deal with that.
Yeah, I this kind of brought back memories of like the first time I walked into like an academic library for the first time.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it's just like, even compared to like a municipal library, like there's just so much like arcane knowledge that no one person could ever go through all of it. And yeah, but all of it seems like fascinating in its own way. I will say, I know you just heard the thing about how there's no greater significance to some of the numerology of the story.
According to Borges.
Yeah, fair enough. But I will say, I personally found the particular note of the books being exactly 410 pages to be maybe horrifying is a strong word, but stressful, because like I feel like 410 is like the point in like the length of a book where I'm like, it stops being just like a normal book and like all of a sudden like, oh man, this is like a big book.
Yeah. You're like, shit. Yeah.
It's just like, there's nothing in this library that's even like manageable in terms of what there is to read. You always are like dealing with a book that's just slightly too long to be, fun to read.
Yeah, it's like heavy and you're like, fuck, I don't know what's going to be in here. It could be literally anything.
Well, anything else we want to say about the Infinite Library of Babel before we move on?
I will say we've sort of already talked about it, but this is more of an anecdote. I once gave a presentation in a class about magical realism, where I argued that this story was about the religious experience of the numinous, and I won't get into that argument here. But the funny thing about that class was it was a magical realism class, and they didn't assign any Borges. So me and the teacher just talked about Borges, and everyone else in the class goes, man, I wish I had read some Borges. Like it was just me and the teacher going like, man, that Borges is great. And we read like a lot of magical realism, but somehow we didn't read any Borges. And I think that's a nice transition into the next story, because Borges like was labeled magical realism, but he's not the kind of magical realism we think, which is usually involved, as we might say, like magical things treated sort of common sense, like normal, like with a sense of reality. And I'm thinking, of course, like it's the famous quote that Gabriel Garcia Marquez says about 100 Years of Solitude, which is that his grandmother would tell him stories that were just as real as if, like, for instance, somebody was ascended to heaven and they never saw her again. Or there was a giant eagle that fell in somebody's backyard and talked to people. And she would tell them in the same way as if, you know, your actual father did this. And according to Marquez, that was the inspiration for a lot of 100 Years of Solitude. But with Borges, and as we'll talk, I think now we can sort of move to Tlon, Uqbar, Orbis Tertius, is that the real and the fake are presented just as equally. And the made up citation, which Borges loves doing, is co-mingled with the actual real citation. And that's kind of like the magical realist aspect of his book, I would say, or of his stories, I would say.
Well, you know, it's interesting because I feel like, again, when you kind of think of the classic idea of magical realism as regarding kind of Latin American fiction, it's maybe allegorical is a blunt way to put it. I don't know if that's exactly the right word, but there's kind of this idea that it's like you're writing about fantastic things to like say something about like material or like political reality that like can't be said for various reasons.
Yeah, as my teacher described, there is that woman who is so beautiful in 100 Years of Solitude that she ascends to heaven, and she's the one that also has like the mind of an infant. Anyway, my teacher said, you know what happened is she probably got knocked up and then she joined a monastery and no one ever saw her again. Like is the way my teacher explained this sort of real part of that. So yeah, I totally agree. And
I think Borges isn't doing that. I think that he's you know, you can take away meaning about life and like lived experience, and even some political things I think from his writing, but they're not. I don't think they're doing quite the same kind of sleight of hand in terms of the way that they're using the fantastic as kind of a way to, kind of, what's the word I'm looking for here? The best way I can think is like, sleight of hand. You're kind of distracting with the fantastic to say something that either you can't or it isn't safe to say. Whereas Borges, the fantastic is much more direct because the fantastic is meant to unmoor you from kind of regular logic and make you think in ways that you're not used to.
Yeah, and speaking of which, the opening bit of Tlon, which I think we can continue with. I mean, it's quite a long paragraph. I will mention
to read, or
actually, you should read it, John, because I have a note I want to say about the person that gets mentioned in the opening paragraph that I didn't know the first maybe dozen times I read this. So first paragraph.
Tlon Uqbar Orbis Tertius. 1. I owe the discovery of Uqbar to the conjunction of a mirror and an encyclopedia. The mirror troubled the depths of a corridor in a country house on Genoa Street in Ramos Mejia. The encyclopedia is fallaciously called the Anglo-American Cyclopedia, New York, 1917, and is a literal but delinquent reprint of the Encyclopedia Britannica of 1902. The event took place some 5 years ago. Bioy Casares had dinner with me that evening, and we became lengthily engaged in a vast polemic concerning the composition of a novel in the first person, whose narrator would omit or disfigure the facts and indulge in various contradictions which would permit a few readers, very few readers, to perceive an atrocious or banal reality. From the remote depths of the corridor, the mirror spied upon us. We discovered, such a discovery is inevitable in the late hours of the night, that mirrors have something monstrous about them. Then Bioy Casares recalled that one of the heresiarchs of Uqbar had declared that mirrors in copulation are abominable because they increase the number of men. I asked him the origin of this memorable observation, and he answered that it was reproduced in the Anglo-American Cyclopedia in its article on Uqbar. The house, which we had rented furnished, had a set of this work. On the last pages of volume 46, we found an article on Uppsala. On the first pages of volume 47, on Ural-Altaic languages, but not a word on Uqbar. Bioy, then taken aback, consulted the volumes of the index. In vain, he exhausted all of our imaginable spellings. Uqbar, 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 Uqbar. Before leaving, he told me that it was a region of Iraq or of Asia Minor, but I confess that I agreed with some discomfort. I conjectured that this undocumented country and its anonymous heresiarch were a fiction devised by Bioy's modesty in order to justify a statement. The fruitless examination of one of Justice Perethi's atlases fortified my doubt.
So as the narrator says, we're indulging in a story in which some contradictions are present, and you can glance a banal or atrocious reality. And his friend, Bioy Casares, was his actual friend. So he puts this sort of fictional occurrence in the mouth of his actual friend. And I didn't know this, but apparently Borges and Casares had like a really long, fruitful relationship. They wrote a lot of novels in sort of the duo, the two of them. Casares is famous for writing what some people think is like the first science fiction South American story, The Invention of Dr. Morel, which my friend really likes, but I haven't read. And so even in the beginning, there's this thing that happens that maybe didn't really happen, but the guy who's there is a real guy. He's not a made up person. It's a real person who is there for this sort of citation problem, or the idea where you remember something in a book and you go to look it up and it's not there.
I really love this opening. I think that the edition of his work I have here, Labyrinths, it starts, this is the first story in it, and I think that you kind of just get all of Borges really kind of summated in that first line. I owe the discovery of Uqbar to the conjunction of a mirror and an encyclopedia.
Yeah.
I think that those are really the two like great image of like the Borgesian aesthetic. And this story is just perfect and really something that I just loved so deeply. So we start there. The mirror, the encyclopedia, we discover that one of the heresiarchs of Uqbar said that mirrors and copulation are abominable, for they lead to the multiplication of men. Who could disagree? And kind of to skim a little bit just to get to kind of the important stuff, because this is probably like the plottiest story of the three we read, which not saying much, but there is still like a little more kind of a legwork we have to do here.
There's a lot of citations in this one. It's very important that the citations are tracked down. So yeah.
So eventually they do track down a version of this encyclopedia that does have the article on Uqbar within, and they discover that Uqbar is this country that is known for having a very unique literature. It's not like the literature of any other country that you would maybe associate with the place it comes from. There's only one trait that is worthy of recollection. It is noted that the literature of Uqbar was one of fantasy, and that its epics and legends never referred to reality, but to the two imaginary regions of Milanias and Tlon. And that is really where the story gets strange and interesting.
Yeah, so that citation, like looking up Uqbar reveals like another made up citation where this world is purely ideas. Ideas are the realest thing. There is no material reality. And so the literature of Uqbar is all fantastical. And as we're told at one point, like, there are no proper nouns. There's only like sort of adjectives and verbs, I believe. So
let me stop you there, Ben. You're just slightly off base. Your Uqbar is not like that. Tlon is a land where there is no where it is a world of pure idealism, and language does not work the way that it does in our world, and that's something that I did find really interesting. So as Ben kind of mentioned there, the languages of Tlon and are kind of split between two large families. There's the languages of the Northern Hemisphere. So in the Northern Hemisphere, the prime unit of their language is the monosyllabic adjective. The noun is formed by an accumulation of adjectives. They do not say moon, but rather round, airy, light on dark, or pale orange of the sky, or any other such combination. Whereas in the North, they are more fixated on verbs. There is no word corresponding to the word for moon, but there is a verb which in English would be to moon or to mooninate. The moon rose above the river is Lord Yufang XXS Malo, or literally upward behind the on-screaming it mooned.
Yeah, so things are like purely the qualities, sort of.
Yes. So essentially, it goes on to describe this world where there is, material reality is essentially held to be something of a fiction. People do not have like a strong sense that things like persist from one moment to another. And their language does not seem to place a great deal of value on things outside of either their action or their seeming. There's no kind of idea of existence in and of itself. And I really liked this section because it got me thinking a lot about like the way language just functions. There's a lot made of the language of syllables, the language of the Southern Hemisphere, the way that it illustrates the poetic reality of a thing more than the actual reality.
Right.
And it got me thinking about kind of the interesting way that language like develops in the real world, where we're constantly trying to describe like the reality of something, and we're always coming up short because of kind of the gap between language and reality, and kind of this idea of a language that takes primacy over reality.
Right.
A language that is actually like developed like for poets for the purpose of like illustrating poetic reality, and to which like the actual like useful description of things is kind of superfluous.
Yeah, and you know, if to quote one of the better Nietzsche essays, like our normal language is because the poetic functions are dead. As he says in Truth and Lies in the Extramoral Sense, it's like things that are true were once poetic and now they're just sort of like dull and useless. And so like it's sort of funny that Borges like goes, well, what if we reverse that? And it was like, what if everything was poetic description and nothing was like dull, and sort of the truth of something wasn't sort of like dead under so many like word changes. And so, John, that then infects the entire world.
Yes. So it's a bit of an interesting turn the story takes, where there's sort of intimations that, again, the literature of Tlon, of Uqbar describing Tlon it's this strange thing. It's kind of this hidden sleight of hand in this one particular encyclopedia. But after it's discovered, there's kind of this attempt by the narrator to kind of piece together where these things fit in. And the conclusion he kind of reaches is that the project of Tlon, of Uqbar and Tlon, is the work of kind of this shadowy cabal of like hermetic thinkers who...
And a Southern secessionist who's like a billionaire.
A Southern secession, a free-thinking Southern secessionists who kind of start the project of creating Tlon with kind of esoteric goals. Once the Southern guy gets involved, he makes it pretty clear that his reason for like funding this cabal is that he wants to basically prove that there is no God because men are just as capable of creating a world by themselves.
And specifically, not the imposter Jesus Christ is the quote. It's the quote that's given. Honestly, John, that part blew me away this time. I totally forgot that Borges is just like, yeah, there's an insane Southern American billionaire who's basically like, I'm going to create my own world to do a one-upmanship on Christianity, basically. like I will create an entire planet that of which Tlon and Uqbar are just one part of.
Yes, it's specifically like it said that he basically tells this cabal, who are kind of this odd mystical sect who are kind of generationally producing this fictional reality as kind of like a mystical game.
Yeah.
He comes to them and is like, hey, what if you guys created a whole planet? A country, that's small time. Like, you got to create a whole world so you can show, so everyone can know God doesn't exist. And he dies and he leaves them all of his slaves and all his wealth to kind of go about this project. And okay, let me step back for a second, because I think the interesting thing that does happen in this story, I mean, obviously everything is interesting here, but it is interesting that this does kind of take this very kind of sci-fi turn towards the end.
Yeah.
Where we get like a postscript and the narrator kind of returns. I guess it is kind of supposed to be Borges, presumably literally coming back and writing in like 1944 that the study of this fictional world of Tlon has slowly begun to like metastasize and take over like the intellectual life of the entire world. I find this really hard to read kind of outside of the context again of kind of Borges having lived through World War II.
Honestly, also date wise, so it was first published not in a book in a magazine in 1940, and the postscript says 1947. So like
Yes,
he's
47.
like, so the person reading it, if we were thinking about it in the first occurrence, would suddenly get to the end where it says the future, basically. And in the future, as you said, John, the ideas of pure like idealism and poetic language have infected the world.
Yeah. And basically, like, people have stopped studying like real literature and real history and real languages so that they can start to study like Tlonese, basically.
Yeah.
And like Tlonese history, which is full of moving episodes that seem to carry so much more meaning and weight than our history does.
Yeah.
And again, like there's definitely like an element here where it feels kind of like, if Babel is kind of about meaning collapsing, I mean, I think there's definitely an element of that here. I think it's also kind of about like ideology and the way that, like, to me, Tlon reads very much as kind of Enlightenment ideology. Like, we can create like the perfect rational world, and we can totally paper over reality with this perfect vision of what reality should be. And we can do away with all the ugliness of the past. We can put all that to rest, and we can ignore history and kind of replace it with this more emotionally satisfying and like logically satisfying history. But it also got me thinking a lot about kind of like world building.
Yeah.
Like, do you know a lot about like world building in terms of kind of like fantasy and science fiction literature?
I mean, I know sort of I feel like I know the kind of meme discussions about world building in terms of like we gotta have world building, you gotta have the world happen. Sometimes the narrative stops so we can just do world building, and then other times like we build a world and then fans of the world want to build it out in a way that's different from the way the author created it.
Yeah, so I found myself thinking a lot about this. You know, I read a lot of fantasy literature, and kind of as I've matured in my taste, you know, you kind of are like, what is it that works about, Tolkien or Robert E. Howard or so like China Mieville,
yeah.
To name someone more contemporary, versus like Brandon Sanderson, who, I've read some of his books, and I'm not like a fan by any means. And I think that kind of one of the things that I think really doesn't work with a lot of modern, not just fantasy, but kind of any genre that is like doing world building, is that it feels like a lot of time people are more invested in building a world than building than telling a story. And, there's kind of always this feeling that, oh, this is really here to like fill up a wiki, that someone can just spend hours like combing through the recesses of
the citations.
The citations, kind of this idea of losing yourself in this ideal world, not ideal as in like perfect, but ideal as in like logically consistent and like built up with an idea in mind.
Yeah.
And there's something about that I find, I don't mean to like moralize, but I find somewhat suspect. There is this element to it where it feels like a real cringing away from reality. When I think about what works for me in good fantasy literature, it's this idea of a world that is always bigger than what you're seeing.
Yeah.
I think that, Tolkien does this. I think stuff like Dark Souls does this very well, versus like a world that is completely like circumscribed, wholly legible. There's, anywhere you visit on the map, like you know exactly what's there and you know what to expect. And it's the safe place you can like retreat and feel very safe from when the world seems scary. And maybe there is some value in that. But I don't know. This story like made me feel very weird about that whole idea of trying to build a perfect world.
Well, and John, there's a great parallel there between the Tlon apostasy, which Borges kind of indulges in a great parody of Zeno's paradoxes, which if you're not familiar, one of Zeno's paradoxes is like Achilles and a tortoise are essentially racing, and he basically uses like a definition of movement where in order to get from one side to the other side, you have to cross the midpoint. But to get between the first side and the midpoint, you have to cross the midpoint of that. And so therefore, like, distance is impossible. And Achilles and the tortoise move at the exact same speed. And of course, that's, disproven by various people. But Borges' version of that is in Tlon, there's a paradox where, like, basically different people lose what is essentially like different coins along a route. And according to the Tlonese, each one of those coins is a separate entity. In other words, as your example, John, like every time I do a little bit of world building, it implies a unity which is not there, or we describe the entire unity. And the heresy for a Tlon is to assume that these coins are the same coin and not different instances of a coin that has been sort of conjectured into being each time it is lost. Because the idea of like when you lose the coin, then it becomes real. And so when somebody finds a coin, it's not one of the coins that the person lost. It's a whole new coin. And so like, as you were saying, John, it's far more interesting where a world is implied, which is a bit more like the Tlon way of thinking, even if like, this would imply that like every time you do fantasy world building, there's a slightly different version of a world. Whereas the sort of real one is that the world exists perfectly circumscribed out there. And we want that, not the flashes of something. And so the Tlon heresy is that like any of these coins lost could be the same coin and not an entirely different coin that's birthed into being by the sort of idea of losing it.
Yeah. One of the kind of interesting asides, kind of the last portion of the book that of the book before the postscript is describing this phenomenon in Tlon where basically objects like it's describing the duplication of lost objects, and these duplicate items are called Hronier. And they are like, so if Ben and I like lost a pencil and we're both looking for it and we both found a pencil, to the Tlonese, this is actually evidence of a second pencil having just materialized in reality by the fact that we're both looking for it.
Right. Yeah. The idea of it makes it real. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I found this section to be very interesting this time. So it describes this phenomenon and the way that it happens, and then it describes kind of an excavation that occurs in Tlon, where they discover kind of all these historical artifacts, a gold mask, an archaic sword, 2 or 3 clay urns, and the moldy and mutilated torso of a king whose chest bore an inscription which it has not yet been possible to decipher. That's
very Dark Souls item description. You had mentioned that, yeah, especially that last bit. Yeah, so.
But the thing I found myself thinking as I was reading this section this time, so this is my second time reading the story, I found myself wondering, and maybe this is me again kind of getting lost in the sauce and missing Borges' point, but I'm finding myself wondering, so Tlon is a world where the people are operating under like an assumption of absolute idealism.
Yeah.
But is the world absolutely idealistic? Are these actually objects that have been summoned into existence by the fact that people are looking for them, or are these just people who are so like wrapped up in their psychology and philosophy that they can't recognize actual historical artifacts and like place them, within like a narrative because they have no conception of the past or the future?
And honestly, that's a great sort of a parody of like having a purely poetic language where like almost everything is the new thing, or like you're constantly being reborn goldfish like in your descriptive faculties. So it would be very funny if like Tlon actually encountered a real historical artifact that they thought up, but it was actually real, and they would just be like, oh man, I just found this because I was thinking about it. It's like, well,
they say that the Hronier, there's like a descending like layer of like reality. Like, so again, if Ben and I lost the pencil, like if we found a third pencil, it would be like slightly less like accurate to the original than the second one, up until you reach the 12th one, where it like circles back around.
There's again, that circling back again, like in the library, like the layers of fiction sort of come back to something at some point.
Yeah, but also like I found myself thinking like, okay, but is that actually what's happening? Or again, are people just like finding two different pencils, and because they don't have like an idea of like how causality works, they just assume that there can't be like a second pencil that was just nearby that they found. It just happens to look different than the first pencil. There has to be this metaphysical process happening where their cognition is summoning the second pencil into existence, but slightly off from the original.
well, and also like there's a fix for part of it where I believe it's the idea. I think it's George Berkeley's God. Because George Berkeley was sort of Borges is kind of riffing on his pure idealism. And so Berkeley goes, well, there's one guy who was watching the whole time, and it's God. And so the idea that like God is keeping track of all of this stuff if we forget about it because of the way ideas sort of dissolve or change or forget about it. So like in order to avoid this sort of profusion of John and I finding separate pencils, there's God who saw us find the pencil, and so that's how we prevent that from happening. Like there's a guy who's seeing it all. Now, as you were saying, John, it doesn't solve the idea of like what the Huronin are exactly and why the level of reality deteriorates. But I think the interesting part for at least the story is that like the strength of these ideas are so viral enough that they can sort of change the material world. And like, as Borges says, even like it used to be that people were into Marxism and Nazism, and now they're just into Tlonism. Like the idea of just like pure idealism being so contagious that like, even if there was, as you're sort of hinting at, an actual material reality in terms of historical artifacts, it's papered over by the purely descriptive potential.
It's more like there's this level where, because we discover Tlon is like a purposeful construction, like it becomes a question of whether or not this like idea of a Hronir is something that exists to make history impossible, to make the rediscovery of reality impossible once the Tlon mind virus has made everyone woke.
Yeah, that also reminds me, there's a great bit in Crying of Lot 49 where there's like the materialism of the used cars that one of the characters finds so distasteful, and then there's the like sort of pure idealism of pop music. This is Oedipus Moss's husband, and sort of like Pynchon presenting the like, there's one way of looking at history, which is of all of the junk in people's cars, and you need to remember that junk is real and exists and has no relation to your idealism. Or there's the sort of pure idealism of just like taking a bunch of acid and listening to the Beatles, being like, man, this is real, this is everything. So
it's Benjamin's Angel of History glancing back at the detritus of past ages and just being like, huh.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So again, like Borges is giving us the just being like, actually, I'm going to think about these cool ideas that I have, so.
Well, again, I think that again, kind of looking at Borges as like this librarian figure, which is is a theme we've been coming back to. I think that there's kind of this thing too in this story where the closing is pretty haunting, where he's talking about how no one studies like French or German anymore because they're studying Tlonese languages, and he says that he is paying no attention, and he will go on revising his translation of Brown's Urn Burial, which he knows no one will read. And so it also feels like kind of this mid-century thing where I don't know. I mean, there's kind of always a melancholy in like people who are really into books, where it's like, oh, people don't read like they used to,
right? And
it's kind of always been a thing, but there just kind of seemed to be something here where Borges seems to be pointing to this idea that there is something like changing in like the culture of like in the world culture. And that this kind of this shift that's happening that I don't know exactly what he's referencing, because I don't think it's supposed to be a specific like one-to-one allegory, but there's something changing in the world, and the scholarship that he at some level values, even if he problematizes it in a lot of his work, this search for like truth and beauty, like all of a sudden is a much lonelier task. And I think that's interesting.
And too, like we could even, he's translating Thomas Browne, who's one of the great like old English stylists, and he would have written this in Argentinian Spanish. So like even that bit is like he's already kind of standing out. And as you pointed out earlier, like he really loves English literature more. He's read everything, but he loves English literature, especially stylists like Browne. And so like even that sort of detail outside of the context of the story is kind of like marking him as an odd man out.
Yeah. I mean, we could talk about Tlon all night. If you want
until we summon Tlon into being in this podcast, then we just use descriptive adjectives all the time.
I hate to do the MST break the MST 3K rule and remind you of a better podcast than one you're listening to, but Weird Studies has a truly great episode on this story. So if you haven't listened to that, it's good. They have a very interesting take on it, and highly recommended. Do we want to talk about Pierre Menard? And
we got to talk about Pierre Menard.
His big, beautiful Quixote.
Yeah, did you know that the Quixote was actually written by Pierre Menard, John, and not Cervantes? Yeah.
Well, they both wrote it, but Pierre Menard's is better.
Yeah, it's way better. Okay, so you can.
Shall I read our first paragraph?
Yeah, first paragraph.
All right. Pierre Menard, author of The Quixote. The visible work left by the novelist is easily and briefly enumerated. Impardonable, therefore, are the omissions and additions perpetrated by Madame Henry Bachelier in a fallacious catalogue which a certain daily, whose Protestant tendency is no secret, has had the inconsideration to inflict upon its deplorable readers, though these be few and Calvinist, if not Masonic and circumcised. The true friends of Menard have viewed this catalogue with alarm, and even with a certain melancholy. One might say that only yesterday we gathered before his final monument, amidst the lugubrious cypresses, and briefly, error already tries to tarnish his memory. Decidedly, a brief rectification is unavoidable.
We gotta, Pierre Menard died. We gotta talk about his work. We're gonna upset a couple of Masonic Calvinists, but we gotta do it anyway. Yeah.
So I think this is the funniest of the stories. I mean, all of them have had definitely elements of humor to them, but this one really feels like Borges riffing on a world that I'm sure he was deeply familiar with, that of kind of very self-serious, like literary artists and critics.
Yeah.
The opening here is describing the Pierre Menard is dead. An old patron of his, a deplorable woman, Madame Bachelier, has provided an inaccurate catalog of his life's work to a horrible bad food magazine with very few Calvinist or Jewish readers. And our heroic nameless critic here is going to set the record straight. He's going to get the facts right on what Pierre Menard wrote, and he's going to tell us about how great it was. So we do start off with kind of a list of Pierre Menard's, I guess you would say, canonical works.
His oeuvre,
his oeuvre, and it is. Sounds like mostly garbage.
Well, John, there's actually, and I don't remember where I read this, there's an interesting detail, a diatribe against Paul Valery, I might add parenthetically, states the exact reverse of Menard's true opinion. of Valerie. Valerie understood this, the two men's friendship was never imperiled. So Menard actually loved Valerie, but he was dissing him in print. And the thing that we're, I think, supposed to note by that is that Valerie at one point like invented a complete alter ego of like a guy who lived inside his brain named Monsieur Teste, like Mr. Head, basically. And I think there's like an interesting parallel here where like Borges is like, I'm gonna invent a guy who wrote Don Quixote in his like, and who goes, I'm going to write Don Quixote. And in doing like, in sort of inventing this story where a guy sets out to write Don Quixote, not a version of Don Quixote, exactly Don Quixote, we're gonna again sort of do a Tlon Uqbar pure idealism thing, and in doing so, Borges unwittingly invents death of the author at least 20 years before that became like a theoretical practice, and it's kind of crazy that Borges is able to do that in sort of riffing, as you said, on this sort of literary world, but also on the sort of like purely idealistic thought exercises that like Valerie was known to do.
Well, really the core idea here is, Pierre Menard, this sort of romantic symbolist poet and essayist, decides that kind of his great opus is going to be that he is going to do the infinite monkeys with typewriters, eventually producing Hamlet. But he's going to do it single-handedly, and he's going to write the whole of Don Quixote from scratch.
Yeah.
And his our kind of catalogist here explains that at the time of his death, he had perfectly reproduced 2 chapters from part 1 and part of a third.
Yeah.
And the story is really an interesting. Yeah, like you said, it's kind of about death of the author. It's about like, what does authorship mean?
Yeah.
And what does the person who created a work like have to do with the work itself? I really liked the bit where he describes how when Menard first decided he was going to write the Quixote, his original plan of action was to, let me find it here. The first method he conceived was relatively simple. Know Spanish well, recover the Catholic faith, fight against the Moors or the Turk, forget the history of Europe between the years of 1602 and 1918, be Miguel de Cervantes. And he says that Menard started thinking about taking this plan of action and decided it was too easy. And so he decides to write the Quixote as himself, as Pierre Menard, not as a reincarnation of Cervantes.
A man LARPing as Cervantes. Yeah.
Yes. And the strange thing, I mean, he apparently does manage to at least partially accomplish this. Like we said, he produces 2 chapters and part of a third. And to the critic who is reading this, the version Menard creates, despite being identical, word for word, perfect in every way, exactly the same as the Cervantes Quixote, Menard's is just better.
Yeah, and it's worth reading the prose for that part because in my version, he quotes, truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present and the future's counselor. And then our catalogist says, this catalog of attributes written in the 17th century and written by the, quote, ingenious layman, Miguel de Cervantes, is mere rhetorical praise of history. Menard, on the other hand, writes, truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present, and the future's counselor. History, the mother of truth. The idea is staggering.
Menard, a contemporary of William James, does not define history as an inquiry into reality, but as its origin. Historical truth for him is not what has happened, but what we judge to have happened. The final phrase is exemplar and advisor to the present, and the future's counselor is brazenly pragmatic.
He's even doing that weird thing where a scholar like emphasizes certain things, like, yes, this word, like this is an important word, like, and it's in italics in the passage. Honestly, John, he got me a little bit at the end when he starts talking about he goes, he's like, what else could we reread this way? And he goes, this technique fills the calmest books with adventure, attributing the Amatio Christi to Louis Ferdinand Celine or James Joyce. Is that not sufficient renovation of those faint spiritual admonitions? And I go, wow, man, imagining Celine writing about Christ, like, and I started thinking about that. And I'm like, fuck, he got me. Like I'm now doing the thing that he's doing. So,
well, it's interesting because earlier in the story, he describes that the initial idea for Menard to do this kind of came about when he read an execrable book, the premise of which was that what if Jesus was alive today?
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like, Menard, of course, was completely bored and disgusted by this idea, which invariably is just about how people are either all the same at all times or all different.
Yeah.
And, again, it's kind of this odd thing where you take, instead of taking a figure from literature and putting it into the present, you take a book and you just superimpose it into the present.
Yeah.
But you change nothing about it. And, the context, the positionality of the text changes everything. Like you said, what would it mean if Celine had written, the Imitation of Christ?
Yeah.
Like that book, even if it is exactly word for word, exactly the same, the fact that it's being written by Celine just makes it a completely different book than if it was written by whoever actually wrote that book.
Yeah, which I was looking it up earlier. Apparently it was some
saint.
Yeah, some saint, something like that. So yeah, the idea that we could just kind of transpose readings of things basically as we want. Like, yeah, it's the same, but what if we're doing it now? How would that change the meaning of it? And the end, to me, almost mirrors Tlon, where as opposed to being infected, suddenly, like, we could just do this all the time. We could play these games as long as we want. Like we can say, oh yeah, what if David Foster Wallace wrote Don Quixote?
I mean, I do think there is something interesting here. And again, this is also like the story that in a way this story doesn't feel mean-spirited, or even quite as like critical as Tlon does, where Tlon really does feel like this kind of story that's coming from a place of kind of disgust, and kind of horror at the way that the world may be changing, whereas this story feels like much more playful and like you said, this definitely has like shades of kind of the way that academics and critics can sometimes deal with text today, where again it's like, oh, we're queering something.
Yeah.
We're going to do a black reading of The Tempest. And, sometimes that can feel very twee or trite, but sometimes it actually does produce like a very interesting reading. And, I've definitely seen like productions of Shakespeare that by taking the text and, not necessarily saying, it was written by a different person, but by putting it in a setting that Shakespeare would have had no context for, it illuminates a different part of the text, or it highlights something that is typically not highlighted in the text. And, I think that something that is really interesting to me with reading in general is the way that books are a two-way street. You read something and you're kind of doing half the work. Your imagination is doing so much of the lifting. You and I could read the exact same text and we can take totally different things away from it, even if we both admit that Menard is the true author of the Quixote, and that's the version we both read. We're still going to come away with different reactions to it, and we're going to strike on different things in the text that are important or interesting to us. And every text, in a way, can be this kind of infinite, labyrinth that you can pick out all these different things in. And I think that this story is kind of using the Quixote as kind of the stand-in for a canonical text that it might feel like everything has possibly been said about it before, and by suddenly attributing it to a 20th century symbolist, suddenly the text takes on all these new dimensions that we just assume, of course, Cervantes couldn't have had those implications in the text. He was not a modern. How could he?
He was just like a guy. He's not a pragmatist.
All men at all times are in fact the same.
And as Borges says elsewhere, to say Shakespeare is to be Shakespeare. Like, it's one of the characters says, like, if you say his lines, you are him, as opposed to but like with all of that sort of attendant context. I find that Borges sort of like is already riffing on the idea of death of the author like 20 years before it happened to also be absolutely fascinating, because like one of the ways that like Bart's had to do that was like he took one story by, I believe, Balzac, and then wrote about it in like 5 different ways simultaneously. So like in order to prove that you could do that. And Borges is just like imagining some guy being like, hey, what if this guy's Don Quixote was better? And then I love that the story kind of points towards more stuff, but like stops. And that last paragraph is to kind of like get you thinking like, oh yeah, Joyce has a whole thing with Christianity, doesn't he? Like, he wants to be God. Suddenly my mind is working, and I'm like, okay, this thought experiment is one that has legs, and as you were saying, John, like works, because you can just as easily transport something into a new context, and then it becomes almost like a new thing.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting. I think that Death of the Author is one of those things that, again, we, as long as you and I have been interested in literary theory, like that's been a thing that is not like a revelation for us by any means. But I wonder if, Borges like working in fiction kind of made that an easier leap to make, because he's able to create this scaffolding around the idea that kind of makes it like ironic and seemingly less radical. Until you fully like consider the implications.
And like that everyone was doing biographical readings, which is kind of what we still do. Even we've been doing that here today, and I don't think that it's a bad thing. I think that the biographical and like historical context of a work is perfectly relevant. I think that, I always come at it from, believe it or not, a psychoanalytic perspective, where authors don't like fully understand what they're doing when they write. Like, no one has like a full grasp on their own work. Like, it's impossible. There's no way to completely account for every choice you make, in a perfectly logical way. And also, speaking of which, Pierre Menard was the first story that Borges wrote after his head injury. I don't know if you saw that I made a note of this.
Yes, he was trying to prove, he was trying to make sure he could still be creative.
Which, like, I didn't know that until I was researching it, but it's fascinating that he banged his head on a window, and then he was, like, deathly ill, and then he's like, do I still got it? And he writes this story of, like, a guy basically inventing, Death of the Author, like, in the way of, like, Pierre Menard being like, I'm not just gonna LARP as Cervantes. I am Cervantes. This is the context in which this was produced. So
I do think that's interesting from the standpoint that, again, this is definitely the story that kind of has the most familiar form.
Yeah.
In terms of, it's definitely like riffing on a kind of like literary essay that I'm sure Borges was familiar with, or kind of correspondence within like a literary circle he would have been somewhat familiar with, I'm sure.
Yeah.
In a way that, yeah, the Library of Babel and like Tlon both feel not like experimental, but definitely a little bit more kind of free form in their structure.
And this is back when, John, you know, if you were a literature guy, you could get published just saying, hey, check out this guy's books. You didn't have to read an entire journal article and then position your argument in relation to that as to make a new contribution to the field. Like, the field wasn't that defined yet, so you could just go, I'm going to talk about all this guy's stuff that horrible woman did not talk about. Like, and that would be getting published. So
yeah, he didn't need an MA.
Yeah.
Well, anything else? I feel like we've I mean, again, like I said, we could do another 90 minutes on any one of these stories, but I feel like we're probably coming up on time here.
Well, I think we should end, John, because I'd like to end with one last point where we can just riff it out. Is Borges postmodern? And the reason I asked that is because when I had first heard of Borges, I was in my my bug man David Foster Wallace period, where I was just reading nothing but David Foster Wallace, and I found a list that said, 5 great postmodern novels, and you know what number 3 was? It went Gravity's Rainbow, Infinite Jest, House of Leaves, and then it was Labyrinths. And I said, I'd like to read that, and I read that without knowing anything about it, and I had my mind sufficiently blown. Is Borges postmodern? Yes or no? 30 seconds.
Oh, jeez. Okay. Well, this isn't a novel. This is a book of short stories. So it shouldn't have been on that list. But I mean, God, I kind of hate the question. Like, is X postmodern?
Yeah, it's a bad question. Yeah,
it's okay. But no, I think it's fair. I think that insofar as we can say anyone or anything is postmodern, I think Borges is. I think that, again, positioning him as someone who is questioning, I think, these pretty fundamental foundations of kind of Western thought, so to speak. When I look at Borges, like I see somebody who is kind of taking these things that have been kind of great comforts, for like the educated classes throughout history, literature, mathematics, logic, philosophy. He's taking these things that have been like not just sources of like pleasure and comfort, but also like proof of like an ordered truth to the universe.
Yeah.
This idea that like, oh, because math makes logical sense, that means God is real, and that means that I'm going to heaven. The fact that Borges, his project to me at least seems to be to take that and say, not so fast. Like, maybe the math does check out, but the math checking out doesn't mean anything. Like, that does not necessarily necessitate like God or Platonic truth at the top of it. It just means that your brain can make sense of these kind of constructions in itself. Like, literature is not a Platonic form. It's a mental image that we construct, and something making sense in terms of literary convention or mathematical convention or formal logic does not necessarily mean that reality conforms to it, or that, the truth of something is going to have any material impact on reality. And to me, that is, insofar as we can say anything is postmodern, like postmodernism is about that distrust of, logic and kind of the idea that we can narrativize our existence. Yeah. And I think that Borges does a great job doing that.
Yeah, and I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle and be like, I agree with all of that, and that's actually like modern. It's not postmodern. Postmodern is a dumb category, and I think some of the great modernists, and I count Borges among them, was looking at sort of where things ended up. And I think if you take a guy who spends a lot of time in the library reading as much as humanly possible, I think eventually you come up with somebody who realizes that one story is just as good as any other. And where do we go from there? What's true? How do we determine the truth of something? And I think he ends up discussing how irony, like a lot of the stories we talk about, they don't have this sort of cheap, like snark irony. There's sort of like a profound and sort of like charging rift between contextual and literal meanings, between where you are in the world, and between the sort of things you come up with and whether or not they're real. And I think that sort of charges Borges, and I think that's like, if anything, it's postmodern, but I think he's more of a modernist than a postmodernist. But I agree. It's a dumb question.
Ben, you have my mind spinning here a little bit. I'm thinking through what you're saying, and as I think about kind of what we have read, like this reminds me of, like, I'm finding myself thinking of like At Swims Two Birds, which is obviously a work of, I guess you would say, kind of Irish modernism. And Ben, I have a question for you, and you don't have to answer this right now, but maybe this is something we can pick out over the course of the podcast as we go. The whole idea of postmodernism, is it just boomer cope that none of them wrote any good novels?
Yeah. I just looked it up, John. It's true. I mean, I don't know. It's like the boomer novel is like, you think about Updike, you think about Roth. It's like a lot of like social anxiety, a lot of like, where am I? Where's my truth? My parents didn't let me do the things I want to do, and I think like you get a lot of people who write modernist stuff. They read and write a lot, and as a result, like, they sort of understand where the contradictions and the gaps are. And rather than, I think, well, I mean, there is sort of some despair at that at times. I think it's sort of a productive tension as opposed to like,
I get what you're saying from the standpoint that I do agree with you. I think the whole idea that like the modernism was not asking questions about like grand narrative and like whether or not we can like understand reality. The more I'm thinking about that kind of as we're talking about it, I'm like, oh wait, we read Nightwood. Like, Nightwood is not a book about like how the world is fundamentally understandable. That's like one of the works of high modernism. Like I don't know. Yeah, now that I'm like I said, I'm not a big fan of postmodernism as like a term for the most part. And the more I try to think about it, I'm like, are we out of the modern? Are we actually in a different thing? Or is that just something we tell ourselves to like cope with the horror of the Holocaust or something?
Yeah, recently I've been saying, much like the joke, Jeffrey Epstein, the financier, I've been going, postmodernism, the architectural movement, like, and then just like leaving it at that because I'm also a bit tired of talking about it. And I feel like the more that I read modernist and even like pre-modern stuff, that's sort of like looking at something closely enough that you start to notice things that you sort of didn't realize were there, but also start to make you think about what the whole thing is to begin with. That to me seems like what's going on here. And sure, we can call that postmodern if we want, but I'd much rather think about that in terms of modernism as opposed to like, reflection. So
yeah. I mean, I hate to like close out the episode like talking about a book that we're not talking about for the podcast, but if we want to talk about like a book that's questioning like assumptions about like cultural meta narratives, like you and I have both read Dream of the Red Chamber, which that was written during the Manchu Dynasty.
Oh man, and too, like when he gets saved, Bao Yu, he becomes like an asshole. like he's he's an annoying little guy. And I know that the original author didn't write that section, but I found that to be the most like when he sees the truth of the world, he is mean to all of the women in his life who have been taking care of him. And does that mean that it's wrong? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Much to discuss in the future here.
Well, and
I
John,
guess that's what we wanted. I guess we wanted Borges to leave us asking more questions than we have answers to.
And if anything, John, we're still stuck in the library. We can't leave. The library's endless.
Yeah, I gotta go read another 401 10-page book of absolute bullshit. Well, Ben, what did we learn today?
We've learned that Borges is great. We can talk about him all day, and that you should just read Borges as soon as you're able to.
No, Ben, we learned that mirrors and copulation are abominable, for they multiply the number of men.
Yeah, that's why I'm breaking all the mirrors and I'm no longer having sex. So I've been infected by Tlon, John. It's real now. So.
Well, listeners, get Tlon, pick up some Borges. Labyrinths or Fictiones sounds like the place to start if you were a total newbie. But honestly, most of his work, like if you just kind of Google any particular story, I found basically all his stories are on like various university websites, just PDF scans. It seems like his work is in kind of a weird limbo with like the copyright because of like the way translation works in this country. So I was kind of like trying to see if any of them were public domain to do like another maybe reading app, but have not been able to find a definitive answer yet. So
interesting.
Maybe coming in the future. We'll see. But yeah. Well, listeners, thank you so much for listening. As always, Ben and I have to go sleep standing up in our closet beds before we get back to searching for the Crimson Hexagon and the tantalizing Chinese comic books within. But in the meantime, why don't you head over to X, the Everything app, and follow us there at iLibraryPod. If you want to contact the show, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Ben, do you have anything else you want to say out there to the nice people out there in podcast land before we sign off for the evening?
Keep a close watch for Michael Chabon episode 2 coming in 2 weeks.
Wonder Boys. That's also what they call Ben and I.
Indeed they do, John.
Well, until 2 weeks from now, Semper Books.
Semper Books.
Thank you for listening to The Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.